Oh yeah, we're back. Just continuing. So I got the wheels done. Just a few more little fittings that go on to the top of the lumber or limber, and get that out of the way. So, and I'm just orientated the right way so I know what I'm looking at. H23. So that's really it, yeah. So then in my rant about taking care of yourself, nothing else is really going on. All quiet. Been reading a very good book by Peter Hart called simply The Somme, The Western Front's Darkest Hour. It's an amazing book. Anyone who's interested in World War I or even has a passing interest, it's not heavy reading, but so detailed and informative, because what he does is that, and I've seen a lot more history authors beginning to go down this route, and I hope they keep doing it because it's a great idea. What they'll do is that they will write, say, a paragraph, a short paragraph, so it'll be a lot of times only a quarter of the page, giving you the tactical position, or that they're moving such and such brigade is forming up in such and such a place and gets met by heavy fire, for example. But then for you to engage with that, they actually will fill the rest of the page with diary extracts from the men who were there, giving you the first-hand perspective of it. And so you have like everyone from Sir Douglas Haig, Marshal Douglas Haig, who was the overall commander of the British forces at the Somme, right down to privates and corporals and sergeants, just normal men who actually had to endure that day. So anyone who doesn't know a lot about the Somme, it's probably the most iconic battle of World War I, next to maybe Passchendaele and Ypres and Verdun. And well, actually, most of the battles are all iconic, but for the worst of reasons. Like Gallipoli in Turkey is known and iconic for like being the most pointless battle of the war. That it achieved nothing and just killed men for no reason. And the Somme was one of those operations that had a chance to succeed, but unfortunately things went wrong, like happens in combat. So the whole idea was, it was July 1st, 1916, and it was going to be the first major offensive of the British Army in the war to date. They had played smaller roles up until that moment, like Mons and various other areas. So they had, and Ypres, or Ypres, or Wipers as the soldiers called it, in Flanders. So they were under pressure from the French Army Command to play a more active role, because up until then all the major assaults were being launched by the French Army, and they were losing horrendous amounts of men. So they were trying to put pressure on the British to kind of pick up the slack a bit. So they gave them 2 years, so from 14 to 1916, to build up their forces in France, because bear in mind the BEF, or British Expeditionary Force, was only small when it went over. So they had to bring it up to a bigger force to be able to crack the front lines. And this was further compounded by the fact that the French were losing tremendous amounts of men in a place called Verdun, or Verdun. And Verdun it's one of those battles that, again, has no tactical significance in any way, shape or form, but it had a symbolic significance to the French, and the Germans knew that. So I think it was von Schefflin believed that if he attacked it, his idea, and this is literally what he said, that he would bleed France white, basically destroy their manpower. So he began to attack Verdun, and like the whole idea was that he'd attack piecemeal and draw the French in and then destroy them with overwhelming artillery fire. But of course the Kaiser thought, oh, we can do better than that. We'll do a full-blown attack, which was never really the idea. That's not the plan. The plan was to attack, or to fight defensively, and to take the town, let the French try to take it back and cut them to pieces with machine gun and artillery fire, while kind of maintaining or reducing German casualties. But again, the Kaiser went, no, we want you to take it and counterattack. So it turns into a human meat grinder for both sides. But more so for the French, who lose 1 million men. in Verdun alone, casualties. So that was pushing, so the idea for the Somme, and this ties into the Somme directly, the Somme was designed that if the British would attack in force, they could relieve pressure on Verdun by drawing German troops that would be destined for the Verdun campaign away to deal with their assault. So the whole idea was that he would have several 100,000 men to attack a relatively quiet sector of the Western Front. But just because it was a quiet sector doesn't mean it wasn't heavily fortified. See, the German position in the Somme is on a slight ridgeline, meaning that they can look down into the German area or the Allied areas and observe all their movements. So, and at the time, for some reason, it was actually experiences of the Somme that turned Allied commanders to acknowledge the importance of secrecy. Because when they deployed in full view, or when they were doing their what you call their build-up, moving men, material, ammunition up to the front. They did in full view of the Germans, so the Germans could see them. They weren't stupid, and they began to go, grand, we're going to get hit up soon. So they began to fortify their positions, and fortify in depth. So meaning that you did. It's like the Battle of Kursk. The Russians were in a thing called defense in depth, where they would do one belt of fortifications, then another belt, and another belt, and another belt. So once you broke through one, you had to go through a possibly even stronger position, and that's what the Germans did in the Somme, and they did it throughout the Western Front. Like it's defense in depth. That when you hit one line, you have to hit the next, and the next, and the next, and strong points in between to break up your advance. And Douglas Haig had a particularly hard decision. Most of his soldiers, it was an all-volunteer army. There was no conscripts. They're all volunteers, but they're all combat inexperienced, so they were all greenhorns. And he was concerned that if he did a conventional fire maneuver, quick kind of all-out assault that required a lot of planning and meticulous tactics, he thought his reservists would not be able to. He was scared they'd fall apart from the stress of it. So he came up with an idea where it was, and on paper it was actually a sound idea to an extent, was that he would use mass artillery to basically pulverize the German line, cut all the barbed wire, or the devil wires that was known as, or devil's wire. So these are big pickets of barbed wire running the entire front line that at places would be 30-40 feet thick. So obviously, if the soldiers got up to the front line, to the German lines, and found that the wire had not been cut, they'd all get slaughtered trying to get through it. So Haig decided that he would use the artillery to mass fire and cut the wire, destroy the German bunkers, bury them alive in their dugouts, and then have the soldiers would just be able to simply walk across no man's land and find the Germans all dead. So that was the idea. So he amassed an impressive, I think it was 2,400 guns. Massive undertaking, massive amount of ammunition to be stockpiled. So that's why it took so long to plan the bloody thing, and also give the Germans ample time to fortify. And then for 7 days, 7 days and I think 6 nights, they shelled 24/7. It never stopped. And it was estimated that I think it was 7 rounds a second were falling on the German lines for a week. So they fired off more rounds in those 7 days than they did in the first six months of the war, ironically. But the problem was, firstly, at least 3/4 of those guns, if not more, were 18 pounders. And 18 pounders is a lot like the 25 pounder I'm building and the modern 105. That's more designed as an infantry support gun rather than for breaking siege works, if you will, because it doesn't fire a big enough round. Only about 300 guns that the British had available to them for the Somme were actually howitzers and fired anything bigger than an 18 pounder round. So the problem was that most of the German bunkers were about 40 feet underground. So the 17 pounders, or 18 pounders should I say, could not reach deep enough. And then they were firing the wrong type of ammunition for the most part. So they were firing they were making do what they had, and unfortunately they were using shrapnel rounds. And now these aren't to be confused with airburst. They're just basically a big grenade that will just cover the place in shrapnel. So it's great for killing troops in the open, but not for dug-in infantry, because it'll do nothing. And And like ironically, they were doing experiments there with modern ammunition to simulate it, and they fired into barbed wire just to see would they even cut barbed wire, and of course not, because there's no actual explosive force behind it. It's just shrapnel, so it just passes straight through the barbed wire. So the thing was, the barrage looked very, very impressive, and it gave a lot of the soldiers a lot of comfort, and they all just expected to be a cakewalk. So that was the barrage was meant to lift at 7:30 on July 1st. And what they do is, on the last few minutes before they went in, the artillery would go into rapid fire. They'd fire as quick as they could for, I think it was 30 minutes. Just the final salvo, just to cover the men. And then how it worked was, the artillery then would go onto a pre-scheduled timetable, where they would shift and lift fire to various areas at different times. So the idea was that they would let's back to front. So the idea was that they would they'd hit a position, and then say for 3 minutes, because the infantry, bear in mind, are expecting to be moving behind it, and then they would lift onto the next trench, irregardless of the position, because the forward observers would find it very difficult to see what was happening anyway. That was grand. So they all formed up. Most men were carrying about 60 pounds, 70 pounds of equipment. Everything from double ammunition to barbed wire to sandbags, because the idea was that it was going to be a bite and hold operation, that they would cross no man's land, take the German front trenches, bite and hold, so they capture the positions, dig in and wait for the German counter-offensive to take them back. So that's why they're carrying barbed wire, signal pigeons, everything, so they could basically set up forward positions in the German trenches and have some level of infrastructure to help them fortify. So that means the soldiers wouldn't be able to move fast anyway. So if things go wrong, they can't just take off running. And by God, will things go wrong. So basically what happens is, they start going over the top, and everything's kind of peachy for the first few minutes, but the barrage lifts about 4 minutes, 5 minutes before they go over, giving the Germans time to get out of their trenches. And also the Allies thought they were going to detonate mines, these large, some of them like 500 pounds of explosives in them, which, they were impressive. They did a bit of damage indeed, but they detonated them too early, so the Germans could actually use them themselves to set up positions to inflate fire, which means fire lengthwise down the position. So what happened was, the guys started going over the top, and immediately they started getting raked by German Maxim machine gun fire. And like, the British at the time had this weird notion that everything was like a parade ground exercise. So when they were advancing across the lines, they would stop to do their dressing, meaning that make sure everybody was straight and all that. But that means that they were stopping and starting every 2 seconds for the Germans just to rake the shit out of them. And like, so that was fine. Well, it wasn't fine for the men, of course. And then to make it worse was that the artillery that was meant to be covering them didn't take counter battery seriously for some reason. So they didn't suppress the German artillery, which, as the first wave reached, or was left of the first wave, which would be basically 10-15% of entire battalions and regiments. Some brigades were down to 100 men, for Christ's sake. Like, that's a brigade of 800 or 900 men. And like, so when they reached the front line, some of them managed to break through, and actually just sheer true courage and fortitude, they managed to get through the German line in small, isolated pockets. So they weren't concentrated breakthroughs, so they could be pinched out quick enough once the Germans began to counterattack. And the problem was that once the survivors of the assault waves got across, the support waves that were meant to follow up behind them to help them consolidate were cut off from intense German artillery fire. The German artillery had not been silenced and hadn't even been dented. So it fired around the clock. It fired constantly for hours on end, dropping thousands of rounds right down the middle of no man's land and on the British trenches, in a way creating a wall of fire to stop the lads from getting across. So now the lads who did manage to survive against the German trenches found themselves in deep trouble, because now the Germans were counter-attacking. And see, the problem with the British Army was at the time was that it was all by the book. So if your orders say walk across no man's land, you will walk across no man's land, even if it's not working. So even when the machine guns started raking the positions and the plan began to fall apart, commanders and brigade commanders were not the writer. They wouldn't do it themselves. They were reluctant to, or weren't allowed to change the plan. So they weren't allowed to drop their kit and run as fast as they could to try to close the distance. And also because of the confusion from all the shelling, there was so much dust and smoke rounds being dropped to cover the offence. The artillery observers, who were about several hundred metres behind the offence lines, could not see what was happening, so they couldn't redirect their guns to start supporting the infantry. Did I drop a piece? Shit. So like the bloody side effects were lethal, like. So on one day, it was a little bit over 12 hours, they lost 60,000 men, and out of that 60,000, just under 20,000 were dead. To this day, it's the largest loss of life the British Army has ever encountered. There were Irish regiments there were South African regiments, there were Indian regiments. I don't think the Gurkhas were at it. You know what I mean? So the Canadians were there in strength as well. So it actually included all the Commonwealth, you know. And it kind of became particularly notorious because there was a phenomenon known as the Chum Regiment. And the Chum Regiment basically was, or the Pals Brigades, where everybody from a local town would join together in a regiment from that area, or brigade or battalion from that area. But what happened was, when a lot of these entire battalions were wiped out, literally wiped out to about 10 or 15 men. So entire towns, like small little towns and hamlets across Britain especially, had lost all their men between 18 and 30. And like, that's what makes the Battle of Somme kind of so poignant and so remembered to this day, is that it affected not just the men who took part, but entire communities, not just families, but entire communities from full towns, because they all lost someone. So entire like I know a small town, say like something like Athenry, but over in Britain, because I think the Chum battalions were more British thing than they were in Irish. The entire communities were plunged into mourning because everybody had lost someone. So it was an amazingly disastrous thing. I'm just trying to word I was trying to think of it, because an entire generation technically was lost in the Somme. And then because of the first day disaster, and because they'd committed so many men, and they couldn't cancel the offensive, so the next day they had to go on. And it would go on for 6 months. And by the end of the 6 months, around September, oh no, sorry about that, my battery died out. So yeah, so you've kind of got the idea from my little history. I think Carlos Mendez, very talented model maker, and I consider him a very good friend. He was saying he loves my history little tad bit, so that's for you, bud. I hope some of you found it interesting, especially with the centenary for World War One. I don't think there's very few families in Canada, America, and Ireland, to name a few, that have not been touched by World War One in some way or form. In Ireland, it's a very unusual thing because the whole nationalist Republican movement within the country, World War One has been kind of forgotten, because many families felt that it was unspoken because they fought for the British, but in reality the Irish regiments were incredibly Irish in identity. They never saw themselves as British soldiers, they always saw themselves as Irish soldiers. But and they were fighting as well for something like how Australia and Canada had, with the ability to home rule themselves, as in they had their own parliament, their own governments, and they just belonged to a more economic empire rather than direct rule, where we were directly ruled by Britain, you see. And that I can't get really into it now because I don't have 4 hours worth of talking time to explain this country's kind of issues with it, and they are deep and they're complex. So because of that, it's only now that we're beginning to recognise the sacrifices made by at least 30,000 Irishmen who died in the British Army in World War One. which is, it's a shame that they're forgotten. Like, I had family members who fought and died in it, like, and for like, it always kind of annoyed me that these people's contribution has been basically forgotten because it's not, because of politics, that, they died in British service and we can't have that. But like, the reality of the matter was that there were still Irishmen who had Irish ideals, and they were fighting for home ultimately. So that's really it. I'm down to 20 seconds. Time to start calling this picture in. I'm going to start working on the ammunition for this, which will be my next vid when I have that done. And we have the figures, and we'll get down to priming and painting, thankfully. So I'll let you all go. Take care of each other. Watch out for those buses, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye bye.